Close your eyes and let your mind drift back 800 years to the windswept steppes of Mongolia, where winter temperatures plunge to 40 below zero and summer droughts can kill entire herds in a matter of weeks. This is a land where only the strongest survive, where tribal warfare is a way of life, and where the weak are left to die on the frozen ground. It was into this harsh and unforgiving world that a child was born, who would one day command the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, I want to take you on an extraordinary journey through the life of a man whose very name still strikes fear and wonder into hearts across the world. From his birth as an abandoned orphan clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist, to his rise as the great Khan who would reshape the map of the known world, this is the complete story of Genghis Khan. A tale of survival against impossible odds, of betrayal and loyalty, of love and devastating loss, and ultimately of conquest on a scale that has never been matched before or since. But this isn't just a story about warfare and empire building. This is the deeply human story of a boy named Temujin, who watched his father die from poison, who was cast out by his own people to starve on the steppes, who was enslaved and humiliated, yet who somehow found the strength to transform himself from the most powerless person in his world into its most powerful ruler. By the time our story ends, his empire will stretch from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna, encompassing nearly 22 million square miles and ruling over 100 million people. The transformation you're about to witness defies belief. How does an orphaned child, abandoned to die in the wilderness, become the master of nations? How does a young man who once shared a single horse with his brothers come to command armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands? How does someone who began life as society's ultimate outcast end up rewriting the rules of civilization itself? As we embark on this incredible journey together, you'll discover that the path from orphan to emperor was paved with moments of stunning brutality and surprising compassion, of tactical brilliance and devastating mistakes, of divine intervention and very human frailty. You'll witness the forging of a military machine so effective that it conquered more territory in 25 years than the Roman Empire managed in 4 centuries. And perhaps most remarkably of all, you'll see how one man's vision of unity and order emerged from the chaos of tribal warfare to create a legacy that shaped the world we live in today. So settle back, let your breathing slow, and prepare to be transported to a time when the thundering of horse hooves across the steppes could change the fate of civilizations. This is the story of Genghis Khan, and it begins not with triumph, but with tragedy. The year was somewhere around 1162, though the nomadic peoples of the Mongolian steppes kept no written records and marked time by the cycles of seasons rather than numbered years. High on the windswept plateau that stretches endlessly across what we now call Mongolia, a tribal chieftain named Yesugei was returning from a successful raid against his enemies, the Tatars. Riding alongside him, secured to his saddle, was a Tatar prisoner named Temujin, a warrior he had captured in battle. When Yesugei arrived at his camp, he found his wife Herlun in the final stages of labour. As was the custom among the Mongol people, the child's name would be chosen to commemorate recent events, so when the baby boy emerged into the world, his father named him Temujin after the captured Tatar warrior. But there was something else about this birth that caught everyone's attention, something that the tribal shamans would later claim was an omen of extraordinary significance. The infant Temujin was born clutching a blood clot in his right hand, dark and solid as a piece of dried meat. To the superstitious nomads of the steppes, this was a sign that the child was destined for greatness in warfare. that blood and conquest would follow him throughout his life. Some whispered that it meant he would become a great leader, while others feared it foretold a life of violence and destruction. As it turned out, they were all correct, but prophecies and omens meant little in the day-to-day struggle for survival on the Mongolian steppes. Life here was governed by the seasons and the constant need to find fresh pasture for the herds of horses, sheep, goats, and cattle that provided everything necessary for survival. When winter arrived with its killing cold, families would huddle together in their felt-covered jers, burning dried dung for warmth and living off preserved meat and fermented mare's milk. Spring brought new grass, but also the raiding season, when tribal warfare would resume with deadly intensity. The Mongol tribes existed in a state of perpetual conflict, raiding each other for livestock, women, and glory. Alliances shifted like the wind, and today's ally could easily become tomorrow's enemy. Honor and reputation were everything in this world, and a man's worth was measured by his skill with a bow, his courage in battle, and his ability to protect his family and followers. Into this violent and unpredictable world, young Temujin would learn the skills that would one day make him the most feared warrior on earth. Yesugei was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, respected among his people but hardly a major power on the steppes. He controlled perhaps a few hundred followers and several thousand animals, enough to provide a comfortable life by nomadic standards, but nothing that would suggest his son was destined for greatness. The family moved with the seasons, following ancient migration patterns that had been established over centuries. Their entire world consisting of portable possessions that could be loaded onto horses and camels when it came time to move. From his earliest years, Temujin learned the essential skills of steppe life. Before he could properly walk, he was placed on horseback, his small hands taught to grip the reins while his father held him steady. Mongol children learned to ride almost before they learned to run, and by the age of 4 or 5, Temujin could stay mounted on a galloping horse and even shoot arrows from horseback with reasonable accuracy. These were not recreational activities, but essential survival skills in a world where mobility meant life and being caught on foot often meant death. The bow was perhaps even more important than horsemanship in Mongol culture. The composite bows used by the steppes warriors were marvels of engineering, made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew that could propel an arrow with deadly accuracy at distances of up to 400 yards. Young Temujin spent countless hours practicing with smaller bows designed for children, learning to hit targets while his horse was moving at full gallop, developing the muscle memory and instinctive aim that would later make Mongol horse archers the most feared military force in the world. But life on the steppes was about more than just martial skills. Temujin also learned to hunt, to track animals across vast distances, to read the weather patterns that could mean the difference between life and death, and to understand the complex social dynamics that governed tribal relationships. He learned which plants could be eaten in times of scarcity, how to find water in seemingly barren landscapes, and how to care for the animals that were the foundation of nomadic life. The social structure of Mongol society was both rigid and fluid at the same time. Birth determined your basic status, but individual achievement could elevate or destroy your position. Loyalty was paramount, but it was loyalty to individuals rather than abstract concepts. When a leader died or fell from power, his followers were free to transfer their allegiance to someone else, creating a constantly shifting landscape of alliances and enmities. As Temujin grew from child to adolescent, his father began preparing him for leadership. This involved not just military training, but also lessons in diplomacy, in reading character, and in the delicate art of building and maintaining alliances. Yesugei would take his son with him to tribal councils, where the boy would sit silently and observe as the adults debated matters of war and peace, marriage alliances, and territorial disputes. When Temujin reached the age of 9, his father decided it was time to arrange the boy's marriage. This might seem shockingly young by modern standards, but among the nomadic peoples of the steppes, marriage alliances were crucial political tools, and betrothals were often arranged when children were still very young, though the actual marriage would not take place until both parties reached adulthood. Yasuge had identified a potential bride for his son among the Ongirat tribe, a people known for producing beautiful women who often married into powerful families. The girl's name was Berta, and she was about a year older than Temujin. Her father, Dey Sechen, was willing to consider the alliance, but as was customary, he wanted to observe the boy for a period of time before making a final decision. So it was that Temujin found himself living among the Ongirat, separated from his family for the first time in his life. This was both an honor and a test, a chance to prove himself worthy of Berta's hand, but also a potentially dangerous situation if the negotiations went badly. The young boy had to navigate this complex social situation with care, showing respect for his potential in-laws while maintaining his own dignity and the honor of his family. During his time with the Ongirat, Temujin impressed Berta's family with his intelligence, his skill with horses and weapons, and his natural leadership qualities. The betrothal was formally agreed upon, and arrangements were made for the future marriage. But first, Yasuge would return home with his son to prepare for the eventual wedding ceremony and to begin gathering the bride price that would seal the alliance. The journey home should have been a time of celebration and anticipation. The marriage alliance would strengthen Yasuge's position among the tribes and provide his son with valuable connections that could prove crucial in the years ahead. Father and son rode across the familiar steppes, discussing plans for the future and the responsibilities that would soon fall on Temujin's shoulders. But fate had other plans in store for them. As they travelled, they encountered a group of Tatars, the same tribe from which Temujin had taken his name, and a people who had been enemies of the Borjigin clan for generations. The Tatars recognized Yasuge despite his attempts to pass by peacefully, and in a gesture that seemed friendly, they invited him to share a meal with them. Yasuge faced a terrible dilemma. To refuse the invitation would be seen as cowardly and dishonorable, but to accept meant placing himself at the mercy of his enemies. The code of hospitality that governed steppe society was sacred, and even enemies were bound to treat guests with respect and ensure their safety. But the same code had been violated before, and Yasuge knew the risks he was taking. In the end, honor demanded that he accept the invitation. He shared the meal with the Tatars, laughing and telling stories as if they were old friends rather than blood enemies. But the Tatars had not forgotten their grievances against him, and they had prepared a terrible revenge. The food they served to Yasuge had been laced with poison, a slow-acting toxin that would not take effect until he was far away from their camp. Father and son continued their journey home, unaware of the death sentence that was already working its way through Yasuge's system. It was only when they were within a day's ride of their own people that the chieftain began to feel the first symptoms. What started as mild discomfort quickly escalated into agonizing pain, and Yasuge realized what had happened to him. With his remaining strength, he managed to reach his family's camp, but it was clear to everyone that he was dying. The poison was too advanced, and there was nothing the tribal healers could do to save him. As Yasuge lay on his deathbed, he called his son to his side and gave him his final instructions. The dying chieftain knew that his death would create a dangerous power vacuum. Temujin was still just a boy, too young to command the loyalty of adult warriors, and there were others who would challenge his claim to leadership. Yasuge told his son to be strong, to remember the lessons he had been taught, and to never forget that he was born to lead. But most importantly, he urged Temujin to find Jamuka, his sworn brother and closest friend, who would help protect the family in the difficult times that lay ahead. With those final words, Yasuge closed his eyes and died, leaving his young son to face a world that had suddenly become infinitely more dangerous and uncertain. The great chieftain's death would be the catalyst for everything that followed, the moment when Temujin's transformation from protected child to hardened survivor truly began. The impact of Yasuge's death was immediate and devastating. Within days of the funeral, the tribal confederation that he had led began to fragment. The adult warriors who had followed him saw no reason to serve a 9-year-old boy, no matter what his bloodline might be. One by one, the sub-chiefs gathered their followers and their herds and departed, seeking new leaders who could offer them protection and the opportunity for profitable raids. The most devastating betrayal came from those closest to the family. Targutai, one of Yasuge's most trusted followers and a man who had eaten at their table countless times, stood before Hoelun with cold indifference in his eyes. "The winter cold has killed many fires," he said, using an old Mongol saying that meant even the strongest flames eventually die out. "We will not follow a child when grown men need leadership." One by one, the families that had sworn loyalty to Yasuge loaded their possessions onto their carts and horses. They took with them not just their own animals, but many that had belonged to the dead chieftain, claiming them as payment for past services or simply seizing them because no one was strong enough to stop them. The vast herds that had represented the family's wealth and status dwindled to almost nothing. Where once hundreds of horses had grazed around their camp, now only a handful remained. Hoelun stood watching this exodus with her infant daughter Temujin in her arms, and her 4 young sons clustered around her. Besides Temujin, there was Yokikasa, Kachiun, and little Temuge, none of them old enough to be considered warriors. The family also included 2 older boys, Begta and Belgute, who were Yasuge's sons by another wife, creating a complex dynamic that would soon prove explosive. As the last of their former followers disappeared into the distance, trailing clouds of dust across the steppes, Hoelun realized the full magnitude of their situation. They had been reduced from a position of relative power and comfort to that of outcasts, barely possessing enough animals to survive the coming winter. But this remarkable woman, who had once been the wife of a chieftain, refused to surrender to despair. "Listen to me, my children," she said, her voice carrying across the wind as she gathered her sons around her. "We have been abandoned by those who should have remained loyal, but we are not defeated. We are the descendants of the blue wolf and the fallow deer, and our blood is strong. We will survive this, and we will remember who stood by us and who betrayed us." What followed were perhaps the most formative years of Temujin's life, a period of grinding poverty and constant danger that would forge his character like iron in a blacksmith's fire. The family was forced to live as foragers, searching the steppes for edible roots, berries, and wild onions. They caught fish in the rivers with improvised nets and hunted small game with crude traps. The boys learned to shoot birds with their bows, and even the smallest catch became a feast. The contrast with their former life could hardly have been greater. Where once they had enjoyed the finest cuts of mutton and beef, now they fought over scraps of marmot meat. Where once they had drunk fermented mare's milk from silver cups, now they were grateful for brackish water from muddy streams. Where once they had slept on soft furs in warm gears, now they huddled together under threadbare blankets in a shelter barely worthy of the name. But perhaps the greatest challenge was not the physical hardship, but the constant threat from other tribes. As word spread across the steppes that Yasugi's family had been abandoned and left defenseless, they became targets for anyone seeking easy prey. Raiders would sweep down on their meager camp, stealing what few possessions they had managed to accumulate and scattering their small herd to the winds. During one such raid, Temujin watched helplessly as bandits drove off 8 of their 9 horses, leaving the family with almost no means of transportation. In the harsh world of the steppes, being without horses was like being sentenced to death. But the young boy refused to accept this fate. Despite his mother's pleas and the obvious danger, he set out on foot to track down the thieves and recover their stolen animals. For 3 days and nights, Temujin followed the trail across the endless grassland, surviving on nothing but a handful of dried meat and the fierce determination burning in his chest. On the 4th day, he encountered a young man named Borochu, the son of a wealthy herder, who was impressed by the boy's courage and resolve. Against his father's wishes, Borochu helped Temujin track down the horse thieves and recover most of the stolen animals. This encounter was significant for several reasons. It was Temujin's first real success as a leader, proving that he possessed the determination and charisma necessary to inspire others to follow him. It also marked the beginning of his lifelong friendship with Borochu, who would become one of his most trusted generals. But perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that even in his darkest hour, Temujin refused to accept defeat or bow to circumstances beyond his control. The recovery of their horses was a temporary reprieve, but it did nothing to solve the family's underlying problems. They were still outcasts, still struggling to survive on the margins of Mongol society, still vulnerable to attack from anyone who chose to prey upon them. The tensions within the family itself were also growing more dangerous as the boys matured and began to compete for limited resources and their mother's attention. The breaking point came during a hunting expedition when Temujin and his half-brother Begta had a dispute over a fish and a lark that they had caught. In most families, such an argument might have been settled with harsh words or perhaps a brief scuffle, but the desperate circumstances in which they lived had sharpened every rivalry and magnified every slight. When Begta began asserting his authority as the older brother and claiming the best portions of their meager catch, something snapped inside Temujin. The confrontation escalated quickly, with both boys reaching for their bows. Temujin and his full brother Kasar worked together, surrounding Begta and demanding that he accept a more equal division of their hunting spoils. When Begta refused and began to draw an arrow, the 2 brothers shot him down without hesitation. The killing of Begta was a watershed moment in Temujin's life, the first time he had taken a human life and an act that would haunt him in different ways for years to come. When he returned to camp and told his mother what had happened, Herlin flew into a rage unlike anything her children had ever seen. She struck Temujin across the face and screamed at him that he was no better than a wild animal, that he had killed his own brother over scraps of food like a dog fighting over bones. But even as she raged at her son for his brutality, Herlin understood the deeper implications of what had occurred. Temujin had eliminated a potential rival for leadership of the family, and he had demonstrated that he would not hesitate to use violence to protect what he saw as his rightful position. It was a cold-blooded calculation that shocked her, but it also revealed the kind of ruthless pragmatism that might be necessary for survival in their harsh world. The murder of Begta also had immediate practical consequences. Word of the killing spread quickly across the steppes, reaching the ears of the Taichiud tribe, who had been enemies of Yasuge and saw an opportunity to eliminate his remaining sons before they could grow strong enough to seek revenge. A war party was assembled and sent to capture Temujin. not to kill him outright, but to take him prisoner and hold him as a slave, a fate that was in many ways worse than death. The Taichud raiders struck at dawn, surrounding the family's camp before anyone could escape. Temujin tried to flee, but he was quickly run down and captured. As he was dragged away from his family, he could hear his mother's screams echoing across the steppes, a sound that would echo in his memory for the rest of his life. At the age of perhaps 13 or 14, the future conqueror of the world had become a slave. His dreams of leadership and revenge seemingly crushed forever. The Taichud took their young prisoner back to their main camp, where he was fitted with a wooden collar called a kangwei, a heavy device that made it impossible for him to feed himself or lie down comfortably. The collar was designed not just to prevent escape, but to humiliate the wearer, marking him as the lowest form of life in tribal society. Temujin was passed from family to family within the tribe, forced to perform the most menial tasks while enduring constant mockery and abuse. For months, he lived in this degraded state, his body weakening from poor food and harsh treatment, his spirit tested by the daily humiliations heaped upon him. Many prisoners in similar circumstances simply gave up hope and died, their will to live crushed by the hopelessness of their situation. But something burned within Temujin that could not be extinguished, a fierce determination to survive and eventually exact revenge on those who had wronged him. The opportunity for escape came during a festival celebrating the new moon, when most of the Taichud warriors were drunk on fermented mare's milk and distracted by competitions and celebrations. Temujin had been carefully observing the routines of his captors, noting when the guards were most relaxed and identifying potential routes of escape. When the moment finally came, he struck with decisive action. Using the heavy wooden collar as a weapon, he knocked unconscious the young man who had been assigned to watch him, then fled into the darkness beyond the camp. The collar made running difficult and left an obvious trail for his pursuers to follow, but Temujin had planned for this. He made his way to a nearby river and hid in the tall reeds that grew along its banks, submerging himself up to his neck in the cold water, with only his face above the surface. When the Taichud search parties arrived at the riverbank, they could see the obvious trail leading to the water's edge, but the darkness and the thick stands of reeds made it impossible to locate their escaped prisoner. They spent hours wading through the marsh, cursing and threatening, coming within arm's reach of where Temujin lay, hidden beneath the surface. Several times, searchers passed so close that he could hear their breathing and feel the water disturb around his motionless form. As dawn approached and the search parties began to disperse, a single Taichud warrior remained behind, methodically checking the areas his companions had missed. This man, whose name was Sorkan Shira, eventually spotted something that didn't belong among the natural patterns of the marsh. Moving closer, he found himself staring down at the young fugitive who had caused such commotion in the night. For a long moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Temujin waited for the shout that would bring the other searchers running back, for the rough hands that would drag him from his hiding place to face whatever punishment awaited escaped slaves. Instead, Sorkan Shira did something that would puzzle the young man for years to come. He turned away without a word and continued his search in another direction, calling out to his companions that he had found nothing. This act of unexpected mercy from an enemy would stay with Temujin for the rest of his life, shaping his understanding of loyalty and honor in ways that would later influence how he treated his own followers and enemies. Years later, when he had become the great Khan, he would seek out Sorkan Shira and reward him handsomely for that moment of compassion beside the dark river. But for now, the immediate concern was simply survival. Temujin remained hidden in the reeds until well after sunrise, then carefully made his way back toward the Taichud camp. This might seem like madness, returning to the very place from which he had just escaped, but the young man had learned to think like a strategist even in his desperation. He knew that his captors would expect him to flee as far as possible from their territory, and they would concentrate their search efforts accordingly. Instead, he crept back to the outskirts of the camp and hid near the jeer of a family that had shown him small kindnesses during his captivity. When night fell again, he approached their dwelling and revealed himself to Sorkanshira's wife, throwing himself on her mercy and begging for help. The woman, moved by pity for the desperate young fugitive, hid him in a cart full of wool and helped him remain concealed while the search continued around them. For 3 days, Temujin remained hidden in the wool cart, sustained by scraps of food that Sorkanshira's family smuggled to him. On the 4th night, when the searchers had finally been called off and the Taichud had concluded that their prisoner had somehow managed to escape their territory, the family provided him with a horse and directions to find his way back to his mother and siblings. The reunion with his family was emotional beyond words. Holan had feared that her eldest son was dead, and when she saw him approaching their meager camp on horseback, she collapsed to her knees and wept with relief. The other children rushed to embrace their brother, and for a brief moment, the harsh realities of their existence were forgotten in the joy of being together again. But Temujin's ordeal had changed him in fundamental ways. The months of slavery and humiliation had burned away the last remnants of childhood innocence, replacing them with a cold understanding of how the world truly worked. He had learned that mercy was rare and precious, that loyalty could come from unexpected sources, and that survival often required choices that would have been unthinkable in easier times. More importantly, his escape had demonstrated qualities that would serve him well in the years to come. He had shown patience in waiting for the right moment to act, courage in executing a desperate plan, and wisdom in knowing when to accept help from others. These lessons, learned in the most brutal circumstances imaginable, would form the foundation of his later success as a military leader and empire builder. The family's situation remained precarious despite Temujin's return. They were still outcasts, still struggling to survive on the margins of Mongol society, still vulnerable to anyone who chose to prey upon them. But the young man who had returned from Taichud captivity was no longer the same person who had killed his half-brother in a moment of rage. He had been tempered by suffering and hardened by experience, and he began to display the kind of strategic thinking that would one day reshape the world. Temujin understood that their current existence was unsustainable. They could not continue to live as foragers and outcasts, constantly running from stronger enemies and scraping for survival in the wilderness. If they were to have any hope of rebuilding their fortunes and reclaiming their rightful place in Mongol society, they needed allies, and they needed them soon. His thoughts turned to Jamuka, his father's sworn brother, and the man Yasuge had specifically mentioned on his deathbed. Jamuka had been Temujin's childhood friend, and if the bonds of that friendship remained strong, he might be willing to provide protection and support for Yasuge's family. It was a dangerous gamble, because approaching Jamuka would also reveal their weakness and vulnerability, but it seemed like their best hope for survival. The decision to seek out Jamuka marked the beginning of a new phase in Temujin's life, one that would see him gradually transform from a desperate refugee into a leader in his own right. But it would also set in motion a chain of events that would eventually pit him against his childhood friend, in a struggle that could only end with one of them dead and the other supreme ruler of all the Mongol tribes. As Temujin prepared for this fateful journey, he could not have imagined that he was taking the first steps toward creating an empire that would stretch from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, or that his name would one day strike fear into the hearts of kings and emperors across 3 continents. For now, he was simply a young man, trying to keep his family alive in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. But the qualities that would one day make him Genghis Khan were already taking shape in the crucible of adversity and loss. The reunion between Temujin and Jamuka was everything the young man had hoped for and more. When he finally located his childhood friend's camp, after days of searching across the steppes, Jamuka welcomed him with genuine warmth and affection. The 2 young men embraced like the brothers they had once sworn to be, and Jamuka immediately invited Temujin's entire family to join his growing confederation of followers. For the first time in years, Temujin's family enjoyed something approaching security and prosperity. They had adequate food, proper shelter, and the protection of Jamuka's warriors. The children began to recover from the malnutrition and stress that had marked their years as outcasts, and Holan was able to hold her head high once again as the widow of a respected chieftain, rather than the mother of desperate refugees. But perhaps most importantly for Temujin's future development, he found himself in an environment where he could observe effective leadership in action. Jamuka had grown into a charismatic and successful war leader, skilled at building alliances and commanding loyalty from his followers. Temujin watched and learned, studying the ways his friend motivated his warriors, settled disputes, and made the countless decisions required to hold together a confederation of proud and independent-minded nomads. The relationship between the 2 men was complex and multifaceted. On one level, they were genuine friends who enjoyed each other's company and shared memories of their childhood adventures. They would spend hours talking about the old days, practicing archery together, and competing in the various contests of skill that were central to Mongol culture. Jamuka seemed genuinely pleased to have his old friend back, and he went out of his way to ensure that Temujin's family was well treated. But beneath the surface, tensions were already beginning to develop. Temujin was no longer the helpless child who had once looked up to Jamuka as an older brother figure. His experiences during the years of exile and slavery had forged him into a formidable young man in his own right, one who possessed natural leadership qualities that could not be hidden or suppressed. Other members of Jamuka's confederation began to notice these qualities and to whisper among themselves about the potential they saw in Yasuge's son. These whispers eventually reached Jamuka's ears, and while he maintained his friendly demeanor toward Temujin, he began to watch his friend more carefully. The dynamic between them was shifting in subtle but significant ways, and both men were aware of it, even if neither was willing to acknowledge it openly. Temujin was no longer content to simply follow orders and accept whatever position was assigned to him. He had ideas of his own about how things should be done, and he wasn't afraid to express them. The first serious crack in their relationship appeared during a discussion about military strategy. Jamuka favored the traditional Mongol approach to warfare, which emphasized mobility, surprise attacks, and the avoidance of prolonged engagements. Temujin, drawing on his observations of how various enemies had been defeated or had achieved victories, suggested that there might be better ways to organize and deploy their forces. The disagreement itself was not particularly heated, but it revealed something that made Jamuka profoundly uncomfortable. Temujin was thinking independently about matters of leadership and strategy, and some of the other warriors were listening to his ideas with obvious interest. For a leader like Jamuka, whose authority depended on being seen as the unquestioned source of wisdom and direction, this represented a potential threat that could not be ignored. The situation came to a head during a hunting expedition that both men were leading. As they pursued a herd of wild horses across the steppes, a dispute arose about the best way to approach the animals without spooking them. Jamuka wanted to use one strategy, while Temujin advocated for a different approach. When several of the younger warriors openly supported Temujin's plan, Jamukha's face darkened with anger. That evening, as the hunting party made camp, Jamukha pulled Temujin aside for a private conversation. What exactly was said between them has been lost to history, but the tone of their relationship changed dramatically after that night. The easy camaraderie that had marked their reunion was replaced by a formal politeness that fooled no one. Both men understood that their childhood friendship had become a casualty of their adult ambitions. The final break came when a group of Jamukha's followers approached Temujin in secret and offered to transfer their loyalty to him. These men had grown dissatisfied with some of Jamukha's recent decisions and believed that Yesugei's son would make a better leader. It was exactly the kind of political maneuvering that was common in Mongol society, but it represented a line that once crossed could never be uncrossed. Temujin found himself facing the most important decision of his young life. He could refuse the offer, remain loyal to Jamukha, and continue to live as a subordinate in another man's confederation. Or he could accept the allegiance of these warriors and begin building his own power base, knowing that this would inevitably lead to conflict with his childhood friend. The choice, when it came, was almost inevitable. Temujin had not survived years of exile, slavery and hardship only to spend the rest of his life following orders from someone else. The blood clot he had been born clutching seemed to pulse with new life as he made his decision. He would accept the loyalty of those who chose to follow him, and he would begin the long journey toward claiming his rightful place as a leader of the Mongol people. When Jamukha learned of his friend's decision, his reaction was swift and decisive. He ordered Temujin and all of his followers to leave the Confederation immediately, making it clear that they were no longer welcome in his territory. The two men who had once sworn to be brothers for life now faced each other as rivals, and both understood that their paths would inevitably cross again in battle. As Temujin led his small band of followers away from Jamukha's camp, he carried with him not just the loyalty of perhaps 24 warriors, but also the weight of destiny. The abandoned child who had once shared a single horse with his brothers was about to begin his transformation into one of history's greatest conquerors. The first steps toward empire had been taken, and there would be no turning back. The wind whipped across the endless grasslands as Temujin led his small band of followers into an uncertain future. Behind them lay the security of Jamukha's confederation. Ahead stretched only the vast emptiness of the steppes and whatever fate awaited those bold enough to challenge the established order. But for the first time since his father's death, Temujin felt something stirring within him that had been dormant for years. The exhilarating sensation of command, of men looking to him for direction and trusting their lives to his judgment. His initial following was modest by any measure. Perhaps 30 warriors had chosen to cast their lot with him, along with their families and herds. Most were young men like himself, ambitious fighters who saw greater opportunity in following a rising leader than in remaining as minor figures in an established confederation. Others were older warriors who had known and respected Yesugei, men who believed that supporting his son was a way of honoring their former leader's memory. Among his earliest and most important followers was Borochu, the young man who had helped him recover his stolen horses years earlier. When word reached Borochu that Temujin had finally claimed leadership of his own group, he abandoned his comfortable life as the son of a wealthy herder and rode out to join his friend. His arrival was a significant boost to Temujin's prestige, as Borochu's family was well respected, and his decision to follow Yesugei's son suggested that the new leader had genuine potential. Another crucial early supporter was Gelme, a skilled blacksmith and warrior whose expertise in crafting weapons and armor would prove invaluable in the campaigns to come. Gelme had actually been given to Yesugei as a young boy, and had grown up as part of the household, making him almost like an adopted brother to Temujin. His loyalty was absolute and unquestioning, based not on political calculation, but on genuine affection and respect. But perhaps the most significant addition to Temujin's growing band was a young man named Subotai, who would eventually become one of history's greatest military strategists. At this early stage, Subotai was simply another warrior seeking his fortune, but Temujin recognized something special in the young man's tactical thinking and began grooming him for greater responsibilities. The early months of independent leadership were a constant struggle for survival. Temujin's group was too small to challenge established powers directly, but they were also too visible to escape notice entirely. They lived as nomads within the broader nomadic society, moving constantly to avoid conflicts they could not win while seeking opportunities to grow stronger through raids and recruitment. Food was a constant concern during this period. With only a small herd and limited resources, the group often went hungry, especially during the harsh winter months when game was scarce and the animals weak from cold. Temujin shared in these hardships equally with his followers, never claiming more than his fair portion of whatever food was available. This egalitarian approach to leadership was unusual in Mongol society, where chiefs typically enjoyed significant privileges, but it earned him fierce loyalty from men who appreciated a leader willing to suffer alongside them. The first real test of Temujin's leadership came when a larger tribe attempted to absorb his small group by force. The Merkits, the same people who had once raided his family's camp, had learned of his growing influence and decided to eliminate the potential threat before it could develop further. They sent a war party of nearly 100 warriors to either kill Temujin or force his followers to submit to Merkit authority. The odds were overwhelming, but Temujin refused to consider surrender or flight. Instead, he demonstrated the tactical brilliance that would one day make him master of the known world. Rather than meeting the Merkits in open battle where his smaller numbers would be a fatal disadvantage, he led his men into broken terrain, where mobility and knowledge of the ground could offset numerical superiority. For 3 days, Temujin's warriors conducted a running battle through ravines and across hilltops, using hit-and-run tactics that prevented the Merkits from bringing their full strength to bear. They would strike suddenly from concealment, inflict casualties, and then disappear before the enemy could organize an effective response. The Merkits, accustomed to the straightforward warfare typical of the steppes, found themselves confused and frustrated by these unconventional tactics. The decisive moment came when Temujin managed to isolate a portion of the Merkit force in a narrow valley with no easy escape route. His archers, positioned on the high ground, rained arrows down on the trapped warriors while preventing any attempt to break out. When the slaughter was complete, more than half of the original Merkit war party lay dead, and the survivors fled back to their main tribe with tales of the devastating defeat they had suffered. Word of this victory spread quickly across the steppes, carried by the survivors and by neutral parties who had witnessed the battle's aftermath. The impossible had happened. A small band of outcasts had defeated a much larger force through superior tactics and leadership. Suddenly, Temujin's name was being spoken with respect rather than pity, and ambitious young warriors began seeking him out to offer their services. Among those who came to join him was Jebi, a warrior who had actually fought against Temujin in an earlier skirmish and had wounded his horse with a well-aimed arrow. When Jebi was captured, most leaders would have executed him immediately as an enemy. Instead, Temujin recognized the man's skill and offered him a place in his growing army. When Jebi asked what would happen to him if he refused, Temujin replied simply that he would be free to go, but that he was making a mistake if he thought he could find a better leader elsewhere. Impressed by this confidence and magnanimity, Jebe swore eternal loyalty to Temujin and became one of his most trusted generals. This incident revealed another aspect of Temujin's emerging leadership style, his remarkable ability to convert former enemies into devoted followers. Unlike many steppe leaders who relied primarily on fear and intimidation, Temujin understood that the strongest loyalty came from men who chose to follow him rather than those who were compelled to do so. He actively sought out talented individuals regardless of their background and gave them opportunities to prove themselves through merit rather than birth. As his following grew, Temujin began to implement organizational changes that would eventually revolutionize Mongol society. The traditional tribal system was based on kinship and hereditary rank, with leadership positions passed down through family lines, regardless of individual capability. Temujin broke with this system entirely, promoting men based on their demonstrated abilities and loyalty rather than their bloodlines. He also instituted a strict meritocracy within his military structure. Warriors could rise through the ranks based on their performance in battle and their contributions to the group's success. This created intense competition among his followers, but it was the kind of productive competition that strengthened the entire organization rather than dividing it. Men fought harder and thought more creatively when they knew that exceptional service would be recognized and rewarded. Perhaps most importantly, Temujin began developing the military innovations that would eventually make the Mongol army unstoppable. He studied the tactics used by various tribes and incorporated the best elements into his own strategic approach. He experimented with new formations and communication methods, always seeking ways to maximize his forces' effectiveness, regardless of their numerical strength. One of his most significant innovations was the development of a sophisticated intelligence network. Temujin understood that information was often more valuable than weapons, and he cultivated sources throughout the steppes who could provide advance warning of enemy movements and detailed knowledge of potential targets. This intelligence advantage allowed his forces to avoid unfavorable engagements while positioning themselves for maximum impact when they did choose to fight. The transformation of Temujin from desperate outcast to respected leader was remarkable in its speed and completeness. Within just 2 years of breaking with Jamukha, he commanded a force of several hundred warriors and controlled territory that provided adequate pasture for thousands of animals. His reputation for military skill and fair dealing attracted followers from across the steppes, and even some of the established tribal leaders began to view him as a potential ally rather than a threat. But success brought new challenges and dangers. As Temujin's power grew, so did the attention he attracted from his enemies. Jamukha, who had initially dismissed his former friend as a minor irritant, began to realize that he was facing a genuine threat to his own position. Other tribal leaders who had ignored the rise of Yesugei's son now recognized that he could no longer be dismissed as insignificant. The political landscape of the Mongol steppes was shifting, and Temujin found himself at the center of increasingly complex webs of alliance and enmity. Some tribes sought to align themselves with his rising power, while others formed coalitions specifically to contain his expansion. The easy victories of his early campaigns gave way to more difficult and dangerous conflicts as his enemies began to take him seriously. It was during this period that Temujin made one of the most important decisions of his career. Rather than continuing to operate as an independent leader, seeking only to protect and expand his own following, he began to envision something far more ambitious: the unification of all the Mongol tribes under a single authority. This vision would drive his actions for the rest of his life and ultimately lead to the creation of the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The idea of Mongol unification was not entirely new, but previous attempts had failed because they were based on temporary military dominance rather than fundamental changes to the social and political structure of steppe society. Temujin understood that lasting unity would require more than just military conquest. It would demand the creation of new institutions and loyalties that could transcend traditional tribal boundaries. He began implementing these changes within his own confederation, mixing warriors from different tribal backgrounds and requiring them to swear personal loyalty to him rather than to their traditional chiefs. He created new units based on the decimal system, groups of 10, 100,000 and 10,000 men that cut across tribal lines and created bonds of shared service and mutual dependence. Most radically of all, Temujin began promoting the idea that all Mongols were part of a single people with a shared destiny. This concept challenged centuries of tribal division and warfare, but it resonated with many warriors who were tired of the endless cycle of raid and counter-raid that characterized steppe politics. The vision of a united Mongol nation, strong enough to dominate its sedentary neighbors and secure in its internal peace, began to attract supporters from across the steppes. The first major test of this vision came when Temujin was offered the opportunity to form a formal alliance with Togrul, the powerful Khan of the Keret tribe. Togrul had been a friend and ally of Yesugei, and he viewed the rise of his old friend's son with a mixture of pride and calculation. An alliance with Temujin could strengthen Togrul's own position while providing the young leader with the backing he needed to challenge more established powers. The negotiations were delicate and complex, involving not just military cooperation, but also questions of precedence and authority that went to the heart of steppe politics. Togrul was clearly the senior partner in any alliance, commanding far more warriors and controlling much more territory than Temujin. But the young leader's growing reputation and obvious potential meant that he could not be treated as a mere subordinate. The agreement they eventually reached established Temujin as Togrul's sworn son and heir, a relationship that provided protection and legitimacy while still acknowledging the older Khan's superior position. For Temujin, this alliance represented a crucial step toward his larger goals. With Keret backing, he could begin challenging the major tribal confederations that had previously been far beyond his reach. The first target of this new alliance was the Tatars, the same tribe that had poisoned Yesugei years earlier. For Temujin, this campaign represented both a strategic opportunity and a personal quest for vengeance. The Tatars controlled valuable territory and possessed substantial wealth, making them an attractive target for any ambitious leader, but they had also committed an unforgivable crime against his family, and Mongol tradition demanded that such wrongs be answered with blood. The campaign against the Tatars demonstrated the effectiveness of the alliance between Temujin and Togrul. The combined forces of the Borjigin and Karaite tribes proved overwhelming, and the Tatar confederation was systematically destroyed over the course of several months. But it was in the aftermath of victory that Temujin revealed the ruthless pragmatism that would characterize his approach to empire building. Rather than simply absorbing the defeated Tatars into his growing confederation, Temujin ordered the execution of all adult males who stood taller than the axle of a cartwheel. This brutal act was designed to eliminate any potential source of future resistance, while sending a clear message to other tribes about the consequences of opposing him. The surviving women and children were distributed among his followers, increasing their wealth while destroying the Tatar identity as a distinct people. This massacre shocked even some of Temujin's own supporters, who had expected the more traditional approach of absorbing defeated enemies through marriage alliances and negotiated submission. But the young leader understood that his vision of Mongol unity could not be achieved through half measures. The old system of tribal rivalry and shifting alliances had to be completely destroyed before something new could take its place. The destruction of the Tatars marked a turning point in Temujin's career and in the history of the Mongol steppes. He had demonstrated that he possessed not only the military skill to defeat his enemies, but also the ruthless determination to remake steppe society according to his own vision. The message was clear to all who witnessed it. This was not just another ambitious tribal leader seeking personal power, but a revolutionary force that would either transform their world or destroy it in the attempt. As news of the Tatar massacre spread across the steppes, the reaction was immediate and dramatic. Some tribes hastened to seek alliance with this terrifying new power, while others began forming coalitions to resist what they saw as an existential threat to their way of life. The middle ground was rapidly disappearing, and neutrality was becoming impossible as the steppes polarized around the question of whether to support or oppose the rise of Temujin. The stage was now set for the climactic struggle that would determine the future of the Mongol people. On one side stood Temujin, with his vision of unity and his growing military machine. On the other stood the traditional tribal leaders, led by his former friend Jamukha, who represented the old order of divided authority and endless warfare. Between them lay the fate of a people who had no idea that their internal conflicts were about to unleash a force that would reshape the entire world. As Temujin prepared for the battles that would determine whether he would become the great Khan or die as just another failed pretender, he could hardly have imagined the magnitude of what he was setting in motion. The boy who had been born clutching a blood clot was about to fulfill that ancient prophecy in ways that would echo through the centuries, establishing an empire that would stretch from the rising sun to the setting sun and leave an indelible mark on human history. The winds of change were beginning to blow across the steppes, carrying with them the scent of smoke and blood and the distant thunder of horses' hooves. The greatest adventure in human history was about to begin, and at its center stood a man who had transformed himself from an abandoned orphan into the architect of empire. The world would never be the same again. The confrontation that would determine the fate of the Mongol people was building like a storm on the horizon. Across the windswept steppes, tribal leaders were choosing sides in what everyone understood would be a final reckoning. The old ways of shifting alliances and temporary truces were giving way to something far more decisive and permanent. This would not be just another raid or seasonal conflict, but a war that would end only when one vision of Mongol society had completely triumphed over all others. Jamukha, now openly calling himself the Gur Khan or universal ruler, had assembled the largest coalition in recent memory. 13 separate tribes had pledged their warriors to his cause, united by their shared fear of what Temujin represented. These were not merely ambitious men seeking personal advancement, but defenders of a traditional way of life that stretched back centuries. They understood that if Temujin succeeded in his vision of unification, their ancient privileges and independence would disappear forever. The coalition that gathered around Jamukha was impressive by any measure. The Jadaran, the Taichud, the Merkits who had once enslaved Temujin, and 10 other tribes brought their finest warriors to the cause. In total, perhaps 30,000 men rode under Jamukha's banner, a force larger than anything the steppes had seen in living memory. Their camp stretched for miles across the grassland, a sea of felt tents and horse herds that seemed to cover the entire horizon. Yet for all its size, this coalition suffered from the same weaknesses that had always plagued steppe alliances. The tribal leaders who had sworn to follow Jamukha remained fundamentally independent, each pursuing his own interests while paying lip service to the common cause. They agreed on what they opposed, Temujin's revolutionary vision, but had no clear agreement on what should replace it if they succeeded in defeating him. Temujin's force was smaller, perhaps 15,000 warriors, but it possessed advantages that numbers alone could not measure. Years of fighting together had welded his men into a cohesive unit that responded to his commands with precision and speed. More importantly, they shared a common vision of what they were fighting for, not just what they were fighting against. They believed in the possibility of a united Mongol nation, and they trusted absolutely in their leader's ability to make that vision reality. The organizational innovations that Temujin had implemented over the years now showed their true value. His decimal system meant that orders could be transmitted rapidly through clear chains of command, while his meritocratic approach to promotion ensured that his most capable warriors held positions of responsibility. Unlike Jamukha's coalition, where tribal loyalties sometimes conflicted with military necessity, Temujin's army operated as a single organism, directed by a single will. The intelligence networks that both sides had developed now became crucial as they maneuvered for advantage across the vast steppes. Scouts ranged far ahead of the main armies, tracking enemy movements and searching for favorable ground on which to offer battle. Both leaders understood that the location and timing of their confrontation could determine the outcome as much as the courage of their warriors or the skill of their tactics. For months, the two armies shadowed each other across the grasslands, each seeking an advantage that would tip the balance decisively in their favor. Temujin, with his smaller force, needed to find a situation where his superior organization and unity could overcome Jamukha's numerical advantage. Jamukha, leading his unwieldy coalition, sought to force a straightforward battle where his greater numbers would prove decisive. The psychological warfare was as intense as the physical maneuvering. Both sides sent envoys to their enemies' camps, attempting to subvert loyalties and create divisions. Temujin's representatives spoke eloquently of the benefits that would come from Mongol unity, an end to the constant warfare that consumed so many lives, prosperity through coordinated raids against sedentary peoples, and glory for all who joined the winning side early enough to earn positions of honor. Jamukha's agents countered with warnings about the fate that awaited traditional tribal leaders under Temujin's new order. They reminded warriors of their ancient freedoms, of the honor that came from following chiefs chosen by birth and custom, rather than ambitious upstarts who claimed authority through conquest alone. They spoke of the massacres that had already marked Temujin's rise to power, and warned that worse would follow if he achieved complete dominance. These competing narratives created uncertainty and division within both camps. Some of Jamukha's followers began to question whether they were on the right side, while some of Temujin's supporters wondered if their leader's methods were becoming too extreme. The psychological pressure was immense, and both armies experienced defections as warriors chose to abandon the conflict rather than risk backing the losing side. The decisive moment came at a place called Dalan Balzut, where the two armies finally converged after months of maneuvering. The battle that followed would be remembered not for its tactical brilliance or dramatic reversals, but for its sheer brutality and the completeness of the victor's triumph. From dawn to dusk, the finest warriors of the Mongol tribes clashed in combat that would determine the future of their people. Temujin's tactical genius was evident from the opening moments of the battle. Rather than meeting Jamukha's coalition head-on, he used his superior mobility to strike at the weakest elements of the enemy formation while avoiding direct confrontation with their strongest units. His decimal organization allowed for rapid redeployment of forces, creating local superiority at crucial points even though he was outnumbered overall. The turning point came when several of Jamukha's allied tribes, seeing the tide of battle shifting against them, chose to withdraw rather than face destruction alongside their coalition partners. This was exactly the kind of behavior that Temujin had expected from an alliance based on fear rather than genuine unity. As gaps appeared in Jamukha's battle line, Temujin's disciplined warriors poured through, rolling up the flanks and creating panic in the enemy rear. By sunset, Jamukha's great coalition had disintegrated. Thousands of warriors lay dead on the battlefield, while thousands more had fled in all directions, seeking only to escape the carnage and return to their home territories. The traditional tribal system that had governed the steppes for centuries had suffered a blow from which it would never recover. Jamukha himself managed to escape the battlefield, but his power was broken and his reputation shattered. The man who had once commanded 30,000 warriors now fled across the steppes with only a handful of loyal followers. The contrast with his former position could hardly have been greater, and everyone who witnessed his fall understood that a new era in Mongol history had begun. In the aftermath of Dalam Balzut, Temujin's treatment of the defeated tribes revealed the sophisticated political thinking that complemented his military genius. Rather than simply massacring his enemies or demanding their submission through force alone, he offered them a choice that was both generous and calculating. Those who joined him willingly would be welcomed as full members of his growing nation, with opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than their past loyalties. Those who continued to resist would face the same fate as the Tatars. This policy proved remarkably effective at converting former enemies into devoted followers. Warriors who had fought desperately against Temujin at Dalam Baljut found themselves promoted to positions of responsibility when they demonstrated their value to his cause. This integration of defeated foes strengthened his army while simultaneously eliminating potential sources of future resistance. The victory also brought Temujin something he had long sought: recognition from the sedentary powers that bordered the steppes. The Jin dynasty in northern China, which had previously dismissed the Mongols as barbarians, useful only as mercenaries or trading partners, began to pay serious attention to developments on the grasslands. Similar interest was shown by the Western Xia and other neighbouring kingdoms, all of whom realized that the balance of power in Central Asia was shifting dramatically. But perhaps the most significant consequence of Dalam Balzut was the effect it had on Temujin himself. The victory had proven that his vision of Mongol unity was not merely a dream, but an achievable reality. The traditional tribal system that had seemed so permanent and unchangeable had been swept away in a single day of battle, replaced by something entirely new and more powerful. Yet with triumph came new responsibilities and challenges. Ruling a unified Mongol nation would require different skills than building one, and Temujin understood that his greatest tests still lay ahead. The steppes were littered with the graves of conquerors who had won great victories only to see their achievements crumble when they failed to create lasting institutions. The months following Dalam Baljut were crucial for establishing the foundations of what would become the Mongol Empire. Temujin spent this time not in celebration, but in the hard work of building a new political and social order. He systematized the military innovations that had brought him victory, creating a formal structure that could be expanded and replicated as his forces grew larger. The decimal system was extended and refined, with clear protocols for communication, supply, and coordination between different units. Promotion criteria were standardized, ensuring that advancement would be based on demonstrated ability rather than personal connections or tribal background. Perhaps most importantly, a new oath of loyalty was created that bound warriors directly to Temujin rather than to intermediate commanders, eliminating the divided loyalties that had weakened previous steppe confederations. These organizational changes were accompanied by broader social reforms that challenged traditional Mongol customs. The rigid class distinctions that had previously separated nobles from commoners were relaxed, with positions of authority open to anyone who could prove their worth. Women were granted greater rights and responsibilities, reflecting Temujin's recognition that the harsh conditions of steppe life required the full participation of all members of society. Religious tolerance was established as official policy, with shamans, Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists all welcome within the growing Mongol Confederation. This pragmatic approach to spiritual matters reflected Temujin's understanding that unity required accommodation of diverse beliefs rather than the imposition of a single orthodoxy. The legal system was similarly reformed, with a new code of laws that applied equally to all members of Mongol society, regardless of their tribal origin or social background. These laws emphasized collective responsibility and mutual support, reinforcing the bonds that held the Confederation together, while discouraging the kind of individual ambition that had characterized the old tribal system. As word of these reforms spread across the steppes, they attracted new followers who saw opportunities for advancement that had never existed under the traditional system. Craftsmen, traders, and intellectuals began joining the Mongol Confederation alongside the warriors who had been its original foundation. This diversification of skills and talents strengthened the entire organization, while creating new possibilities for economic and cultural development. The integration of sedentary peoples also began during this period, as Temujin recognized that his vision of empire would require more than just nomadic warriors. Chinese administrators, Persian merchants, and other specialists were welcomed into Mongol service, bringing with them knowledge and capabilities that complemented the military strengths of the steppe peoples. Yet, even as he built these new institutions, Temujin never forgot the lessons of his youth or abandoned the personal relationships that had sustained him through his darkest hours. Borochu, Gelmay, Subotai, and his other early followers retained positions of honor and influence, their loyalty rewarded with responsibility and trust. This balance between innovation and tradition, between meritocracy and personal bonds, became one of the defining characteristics of Mongol leadership. The transformation of Mongol society proceeded rapidly, but not without resistance. Some of the older warriors struggled to adapt to the new systems, while certain tribal leaders continued to plot against Temujin's authority. The most serious challenge came from within his own extended family, where jealousy and ambition threatened to undermine everything he had accomplished. The crisis centered on his relationship with Togrul, the Karaite Khan, who had been his most important ally during the rise to power. As Temujin's strength grew, Togrul began to fear that his former protege would eventually turn against him. These suspicions were encouraged by Togrul's son Sengun, who saw Temujin as a rival for his father's inheritance and worked to poison the relationship between the two leaders. The deterioration of the alliance with the Karaites represented a crucial test of Temujin's political skills. Togrul commanded significant military forces and controlled strategic territory that Temujin needed for his plans of expansion. Moreover, the Karaite Khan's support had been essential during the critical early phases of the unification process, making him a figure who commanded respect and loyalty among many Mongol warriors. Temujin's approach to this crisis demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of human nature that complemented his military and organizational abilities. Rather than responding to Togrul's growing hostility with immediate aggression, he attempted to restore their relationship through diplomacy and personal appeals. He reminded the older Khan of their shared history and mutual benefits, while making it clear that he had no intention of threatening Karaite independence. These diplomatic efforts might have succeeded if not for the machinations of Sengun, who was determined to force a confrontation between his father and Temujin. Through a combination of lies, forged messages, and carefully orchestrated incidents, he managed to convince Togrul that Temujin was planning to betray their alliance and seize Keraite territory. The final break came when Sengun attempted to assassinate Temujin during what was supposed to be a peaceful meeting to resolve their differences. The plot was discovered at the last moment, and Temujin barely escaped with his life. This treachery ended any possibility of reconciliation and forced both sides to prepare for the war that had become inevitable. The campaign against the Keraites proved to be one of the most difficult of Temujin's career. Unlike his previous enemies, Togrul commanded experienced warriors who were familiar with Mongol tactics and could not be easily defeated through surprise or superior organization alone. The Keraites also occupied strong defensive positions that negated many of the advantages that mobility normally provided to steppe armies. The conflict stretched over several months, with both sides suffering heavy casualties in a series of inconclusive engagements. For a time, it appeared that Temujin might have overreached himself, taking on an enemy too powerful to defeat with his current resources. Some of his followers began to question whether their leader's ambitions had exceeded his capabilities, while others worried that prolonged warfare would weaken the Mongol Confederation enough to invite attack from other enemies. The resolution came through a combination of military pressure and political maneuvering that showcased all of Temujin's skills as a leader. While maintaining pressure on Keraite forces through constant raids and skirmishes, he simultaneously worked to undermine Togrul's support by appealing directly to individual Keraite commanders and warriors. His message was simple but effective. Those who joined him would be welcomed as equals in a unified Mongol nation, while those who continued to resist would share in their leader's destruction. This strategy proved devastatingly effective as cracks began to appear in Keraite unity. Warriors who had fought loyally for Togrul began to question whether they were following the right leader, especially as reports reached them of the prosperity and opportunities available to those who had already joined Temujin's confederation. When several prominent Keraite commanders defected with their followers, the remaining resistance collapsed rapidly. The final battle took place at night, with Temujin's forces launching a surprise attack on the main Keraite camp. In the darkness and confusion, many Keraite warriors were unable to distinguish friend from foe, while the attacking Mongols used predetermined signals to coordinate their assault. By dawn, Togrul was dead and his army destroyed, with Sengun fleeing westward, never to return to the steppes. The victory over the Keraites removed the last major obstacle to Mongol unification and established Temujin as the undisputed master of the eastern steppes. More importantly, it demonstrated that his new military and political system could overcome even the most challenging opponents when properly applied. The lessons learned during this campaign would prove invaluable when the Mongols eventually turned their attention to the sedentary civilizations beyond the grasslands. In the aftermath of the Keraite War, Temujin's followers began to speak openly of proclaiming him Great Khan of all the Mongols. The title carried enormous symbolic weight, representing not just military supremacy, but the achievement of something that had been dreamed of for generations: the unity of all the steppe peoples under a single authority. Yet Temujin was careful not to claim this honor prematurely, understanding that timing would be crucial for ensuring universal acceptance of his new status. The formal proclamation came in 1206 at a great assembly called a Kurultai that brought together representatives from across the Mongol territories. The ceremony took place near the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun, where Temujin had hidden as a young man fleeing from his enemies. The symbolism was deliberate and powerful. The abandoned orphan had returned to claim his destiny as the ruler of nations. as the felt carpet was spread beneath his feet and the assembled chiefs lifted him up to proclaim him Genghis Khan, universal ruler. The transformation that had begun in poverty and desperation reached its triumphant conclusion. The blood clot that had marked his birth as an omen of violence and conquest had fulfilled its promise in ways that even the most far-seeing shamans could never have imagined. But even as the celebration echoed across the steppes and the new great Khan received the homage of his people, his eyes were already turning toward new horizons. The unification of the Mongols was not an end in itself, but the foundation for something far greater. An empire that would stretch across continents and reshape the known world. The greatest adventures still lay ahead, and the name of Genghis Khan was about to become known from the rising sun to the setting sun. The wind that had witnessed his birth as Temujin now carried the news of his elevation as Genghis Khan across the endless grasslands, where other peoples and other civilizations waited unknowingly for the storm that was about to engulf them. The age of the Mongol Empire had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. The transformation of Temujin into Genghis Khan marked not just the elevation of a single man, but the birth of a military machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. As the new great Khan stood before his assembled people, receiving their acclaim beneath the eternal blue sky, he was already envisioning campaigns that would carry the Mongol banner far beyond the familiar grasslands of their homeland. The skills that had united the fractious tribes of the steppes would now be tested against the greatest civilizations of the age. The first target of Genghis Khan's expanding ambitions lay to the south, where the Western Sia kingdom controlled the vital trade routes that connected China with Central Asia. This Buddhist realm, nestled between the harsh deserts and towering mountains that bordered the Mongol territories, had grown wealthy from the caravans that passed through its domains. But wealth without the military strength to defend it was an invitation that no steppe conqueror could resist, especially one who needed to prove his worthiness to lead the newly unified Mongol nation. The campaign against the Western Sia began in 1209, just 3 years after Genghis Khan's proclamation as universal ruler. This was not merely a raid for plunder, though the economic benefits were certainly welcome. It was a carefully calculated test of the military system that had evolved during the years of tribal warfare, an opportunity to refine tactics and organization before confronting more formidable opponents. The Western Shia possessed substantial military forces, including heavy cavalry, crossbow units, and fortified cities that had never fallen to nomadic attacks. Their rulers had grown complacent behind their defensive walls, confident that the barren wastes surrounding their territory provided natural protection against any serious invasion. They were about to learn that the Mongols had transformed the supposed disadvantage of their harsh homeland into the foundation of their military superiority. Genghis Khan's approach to this campaign revealed the strategic thinking that would characterize all his future conquests. Rather than launching a direct assault on the strongest Western Sia positions, he began by systematically isolating the kingdom from its allies and trade partners. Mongol raiders swept through the border regions, cutting the caravan routes and eliminating the smaller settlements that served as early warning posts for the main cities. The speed and coordination of these initial attacks caught the Western Sia completely off guard. Their military commanders had expected the traditional pattern of nomadic warfare: swift raids followed by equally swift retreats back to the safety of the steppes. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once, striking targets hundreds of miles apart with perfect timing and then vanishing before defensive forces could respond. The psychological impact of these tactics was as important as their military effectiveness. The Western Xia had built their defensive strategy around the assumption that they would have adequate warning of any major attack, time to mobilize their forces and coordinate their response. When Mongol armies appeared simultaneously at multiple points along their frontier, this entire system collapsed into chaos and confusion. The siege of Wulahai, the first major Western Xia city to fall to Mongol assault, demonstrated how quickly Genghis Khan's forces were adapting to the challenges of warfare against fortified positions. The nomadic warriors, who had never seen walls higher than their own, felt tents now employed sophisticated siege techniques borrowed from Chinese military engineers who had joined their ranks. Catapults hurled stones and flaming projectiles over the city walls, while miners tunneled beneath the foundations to collapse entire sections of the fortifications. But it was the coordination between different types of forces that truly set the Mongol army apart from its opponents. While siege engines battered the walls and infantry prepared for the final assault, cavalry units ranged far beyond the city to intercept any relief forces that might attempt to break the siege. Supply lines were protected by mobile guards who could shift rapidly between defensive and offensive operations as circumstances required. The fall of Wulahai sent shockwaves throughout the Western Xia kingdom and beyond. Here was proof that the Mongols had evolved far beyond their origins as simple raiders, that they now possessed the capability to take even the strongest fortifications. The psychological warfare that had always been a component of steppe military doctrine was amplified by the very impossibility of what had been accomplished. As news of the victory spread, Genghis Khan made one of the decisions that would become a hallmark of his imperial strategy. Rather than simply sacking the captured city and withdrawing with whatever plunder could be carried, he established a permanent garrison and began incorporating the local population into his growing empire. Skilled craftsmen, administrators, and military engineers were offered positions in Mongol service, while those who demonstrated loyalty were granted protection and the opportunity to prosper under their new rulers. This policy of integration, rather than mere exploitation, was revolutionary in the context of nomadic warfare. Traditional steppe conquerors had seen sedentary peoples primarily as sources of plunder, useful for a single devastating raid, but of little long-term value. Genghis Khan understood that lasting empire required the systematic incorporation of conquered territories and populations, transforming enemies into productive subjects who would strengthen rather than drain imperial resources. The Western Xia campaign also served as a crucial training ground for the military innovations that would make the Mongol army unstoppable in the years to come. The decimal organization that had proven so effective in tribal warfare was refined and expanded to accommodate the larger forces needed for major campaigns. Communication systems were developed that could coordinate the movements of armies separated by hundreds of miles, while supply arrangements were established that could sustain extended operations far from the traditional grazing grounds of the steppes. Perhaps most importantly, the campaign revealed the extraordinary adaptability that would become the Mongol military's greatest strength. When traditional steppe tactics proved inadequate against fortified positions, new methods were developed with remarkable speed. When cavalry charges failed to break enemy formations, alternative approaches were implemented without hesitation. This willingness to abandon cherished traditions in favor of practical effectiveness would serve the Mongols well as they encountered increasingly diverse opponents in the years ahead. The final phase of the Western Xia campaign demonstrated Genghis Khan's growing sophistication as a diplomatic as well as military leader. Rather than pursuing the complete destruction of the kingdom, He offered terms that allowed the Western Xia rulers to maintain nominal independence in exchange for tribute and military cooperation. This arrangement provided the Mongols with a valuable buffer state and ally, while avoiding the administrative burden of directly governing territory so far from their homeland. The wisdom of this approach became apparent when the Western Xia forces proved instrumental in subsequent Mongol campaigns, providing local knowledge and specialized skills that complemented the traditional strengths of the steppe warriors. The integration of diverse military traditions and techniques became a defining characteristic of the Mongol imperial system, allowing rapid adaptation to new challenges and environments. With the Western Xia campaign successfully concluded, Genghis Khan turned his attention to a far more ambitious target. The Jin dynasty, which controlled northern China, represented everything that the traditional nomadic way of life was not. Vast urban populations, sophisticated administrative systems, enormous wealth derived from agriculture and trade, and military forces that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. It was also the most powerful state on the Mongols' borders, one whose very existence seemed to mock the pretensions of any steppe conqueror who claimed universal dominion. The decision to attack the Jin dynasty was perhaps the boldest gamble of Genghis Khan's career. The demographic disparity was staggering. The Mongols numbered perhaps 1 million people in total, while the Jin ruled over more than 50 million subjects. The economic imbalance was equally daunting, with the agricultural surplus of northern China capable of supporting massive armies and extensive fortifications that dwarfed anything the nomads had previously encountered. Yet Genghis Khan had identified crucial weaknesses in the seemingly impregnable Jin state that convinced him victory was possible. The dynasty was ruled by the Jurchen people, who represented only a small minority of the total population, and maintained their dominance through military force and administrative control rather than popular support. The ethnic Chinese majority, while generally obedient, felt no particular loyalty to their foreign rulers and might well welcome liberation by another conquering people. More significantly, the Jin military system suffered from the same fundamental weakness that had characterized all the Mongols' previous opponents. It was designed for a different type of warfare entirely. The Jin armies were structured to fight pitched battles between large formations with elaborate supply systems and predetermined strategic objectives. They were utterly unprepared for the fluid, adaptive style of warfare that the Mongols had perfected during their years of tribal conflict and refined during the Western Xia campaign. The invasion of Jin territory began in 1211 with a series of coordinated attacks that demonstrated the full evolution of Mongol military doctrine. Rather than the single massive assault that most observers expected, Genghis Khan launched his campaign through multiple invasion routes simultaneously, dividing the Jin forces and preventing effective coordination of their defense. Each Mongol army was large enough to pose a serious threat to major population centers, but small enough to maintain the mobility that was their greatest advantage. The speed of the Mongol advance caught the Jin completely unprepared. Cities that had never been threatened by nomadic raiders suddenly found themselves under siege, while the elaborate defensive preparations that had taken years to construct were bypassed or neutralized within days. The psychological impact was devastating, as populations that had considered themselves safely beyond the reach of steppe warfare discovered that nowhere in their vast kingdom was truly secure. The siege of Zhongdu, the Jin capital that would later be known as Beijing, became the defining moment of the entire campaign. This massive city, protected by walls 40 feet high and defended by a garrison of over 100,000 men, represented the ultimate test of Mongol capabilities. If they could take such a fortress, no city in the world would be safe from their assault. If they failed, their reputation for invincibility would be shattered, and their entire imperial project might collapse. The siege lasted for more than a year, during which Genghis Khan demonstrated the patient, methodical approach that complemented his force's legendary mobility. Rather than wasting lives in costly direct assaults, he established a complete blockade that slowly strangled the city's ability to resist. Supply lines were cut, relief armies were defeated in detail, and the civilian population was gradually worn down by hunger and disease. The final assault, when it came, was a masterpiece of coordinated violence that overwhelmed the defenders through sheer intensity and precision. Mongol engineers had identified the weakest points in the city's defenses and concentrated their siege engines accordingly, while assault troops waited in carefully positioned reserves to exploit any breakthrough. When the walls were finally breached, the attacking forces poured through with a discipline and organization that left the defenders no opportunity to mount effective resistance. The fall of Zhongdu sent shockwaves throughout East Asia and established the Mongols as a world historical force. Here was proof that no fortress was impregnable, no population too numerous, no civilization too advanced to resist the expanding power of Genghis Khan's empire. The wealth captured in the city funded further military expansion, while the skilled administrators and craftsmen taken as prisoners provided the expertise needed to govern the growing imperial territories. But perhaps the most significant consequence of the Jin campaign was its effect on Genghis Khan himself. The successful conquest of such a powerful and sophisticated enemy confirmed his belief that the Mongol military system was capable of overcoming any opponent, no matter how formidable they might initially appear. This confidence would drive him to attempt even more ambitious conquests in the years ahead, ultimately leading to the creation of an empire that spanned continents. The administrative challenges posed by governing the conquered Jin territories also forced rapid evolution in Mongol governmental systems. The traditional tribal councils and personal relationships that had sufficed for ruling nomadic peoples proved inadequate for managing millions of sedentary subjects engaged in agriculture, commerce, and manufacturing. New institutions had to be created, new officials trained, and new policies implemented to maintain order and extract resources from populations whose way of life was fundamentally different from that of their conquerors. Genghis Khan's solution to these challenges revealed the pragmatic genius that had characterized his rise to power. Rather than attempting to impose nomadic customs on sedentary populations, he adopted and adapted existing governmental systems while ensuring that ultimate authority remained firmly in Mongol hands. Chinese administrators continued to collect taxes and maintain records, but they did so under the supervision of Mongol officials who reported directly to the Khan. Local customs were generally respected, but any challenge to imperial authority was met with swift and decisive punishment. This flexible approach to governance became one of the defining characteristics of the Mongol Empire, allowing rapid expansion across territories inhabited by peoples with radically different cultures, religions, and social systems. The key insight was that effective rule required adaptation to local conditions while maintaining the core elements of Mongol military and political organization that had made conquest possible in the first place. As the Jin campaign drew to its successful conclusion, Genghis Khan found himself master of territories that stretched from the Siberian forests to the borders of the Song dynasty in southern China. The boy who had once shared a single horse with his brothers now commanded armies that could simultaneously operate across fronts, separated by thousands of miles. The transformation was so complete that it seemed almost impossible to believe. Yet the evidence was undeniable in the tribute that flowed to his capital and the ambassadors who sought audience at his court. But even as he celebrated these unprecedented achievements, Genghis Khan's attention was already turning toward new horizons. To the west lay the Islamic world, with its own great cities and sophisticated civilizations. Beyond that stretched territories that no Mongol had ever seen, lands of unimaginable wealth and power that waited unknowingly for the approaching storm. The conquest of the Jin dynasty had been merely the beginning of a global transformation that would reshape human civilization itself. The name of Genghis Khan was now spoken with reverence and terror from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe. But the greatest chapters of his story were yet to be written. The orphan child, who had learned to survive in the harshest conditions imaginable, had become the architect of humanity's largest empire, and his vision of universal dominion was about to be tested on a scale that would determine the fate of nations and peoples across 3 continents. The winds of conquest now carried Genghis Khan's ambitions far beyond the familiar territories of his youth. With the Jin dynasty subjugated and the Western Xia reduced to vassalage, the great Khan stood at the threshold of his most audacious campaign yet. To the west lay the Khwarezmid Empire, a vast Islamic realm that controlled the ancient trade routes connecting east and west. Its cities glittered with unimaginable wealth. Its armies boasted of their invincibility, and its rulers had grown arrogant in their power. They were about to discover that their world was far smaller than they had believed. The catalyst for this westward expansion came not from Mongol aggression, but from an act of breathtaking foolishness by the Khwarezmid governor of Otrar. When a Mongol trade caravan arrived at his city in 1218, carrying goods worth a fortune in gold and silver, the governor chose to massacre the merchants and seize their wealth. This was not merely robbery, it was a declaration of war against an empire whose very existence depended on the free flow of trade and the sanctity of commercial agreements. When word of this atrocity reached Genghis Khan, his response revealed the calculating mind that lay beneath his fearsome reputation. Rather than launching an immediate assault, he first sent ambassadors to Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, the Khwarezmid ruler, demanding justice and compensation. This was not weakness, but wisdom. The great Khan understood that successful conquest required moral justification, as well as military superiority. When the Shah not only refused to punish his governor, but murdered the Mongol ambassadors themselves, he provided Genghis Khan with all the legitimacy he needed for the devastating campaign that would follow. The army that Genghis Khan assembled for this western expedition represented the pinnacle of Mongol military evolution. Nearly 200,000 warriors rode under his banner, drawn from every corner of his expanding empire. Mongols formed the core, but they were supported by Chinese engineers who understood siege warfare, Muslim administrators who knew the territories they would conquer, and contingents from every people who had submitted to the great Khan's authority. This was no longer a tribal army, but an imperial war machine capable of operating across continents. The campaign began in 1219 with a deception that caught the Khwarezmids completely unprepared. Rather than advancing along the expected invasion routes, Genghis Khan divided his forces and struck simultaneously at targets separated by thousands of miles. While one army besieged the border fortress of Otrar, another emerged from the supposedly impassable Kizilkum Desert to assault Bukhara, one of the greatest cities of the Islamic world. The speed and coordination of these attacks shattered the Khwarezmid defensive strategy before it could even be implemented. The siege of Bukhara became a legend that would be whispered across the Islamic world for centuries. When the city's walls were breached and Mongol warriors poured through the streets, Genghis Khan himself rode to the Great Mosque and declared that he was the punishment of God, sent to chastise the people for their sins. Whether he truly believed this, or was simply employing psychological warfare, the effect was devastating. Here was a conqueror who claimed divine sanction for his actions, who saw himself not as a mere raider, but as an instrument of cosmic justice. The systematic destruction that followed Bukhara's fall sent tremors of fear throughout the Khwarezmid Empire. This was not the random violence of undisciplined barbarians, but the calculated application of terror as a weapon of war. Those who surrendered immediately were spared, while those who resisted faced annihilation so complete that their cities became cautionary tales. The message was clear: submit or perish, but know that the choice was yours to make. Samarkand, the jewel of Central Asia, surrendered without a fight when its defenders saw the fate that had befallen other cities. The Mongol occupation was surprisingly orderly, with craftsmen and scholars protected, while only the military leadership faced execution. This pattern of selective mercy demonstrated Genghis Khan's understanding that successful empire required not just conquest, but the preservation of the skills and knowledge that made conquered territories valuable. Meanwhile, the Khwarezmid Shah Muhammad fled westward in panic, abandoning his armies and his people to save his own life. The psychological impact of this cowardice was devastating. If the ruler himself had no faith in victory, how could his subjects be expected to resist? The Mongol pursuit that followed was perhaps the most remarkable strategic operation in military history, a coordinated hunt across thousands of miles that demonstrated the global reach of Genghis Khan's intelligence and logistics networks. The generals Jibei and Subutai, leading what was supposedly a mere reconnaissance force, pursued the fleeing Shah through Iran and into the Caucasus, defeating every army that tried to stop them and leaving a trail of devastation that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Black Sea. This campaign within a campaign proved that Mongol armies could operate effectively in any terrain and against any opponent, establishing a reputation for invincibility that would precede future conquests. The destruction of the Khwarezmid Empire was so complete that it fundamentally altered the balance of power across Eurasia. Cities that had flourished for centuries were reduced to ruins, irrigation systems that had sustained millions were destroyed, and entire populations were scattered or enslaved. Yet from this devastation emerged new possibilities for trade and cultural exchange, as Mongol rule connected East and West in ways that had never been possible under the fractured political systems that had existed before. The wealth captured during this campaign was staggering, even by the standards of an empire that had already conquered the treasuries of China. Caravans laden with gold, silver, precious stones, and exotic goods streamed back toward the Mongol homeland, transforming the economic foundation of the empire and funding further expansion. But perhaps more valuable than material wealth was the knowledge gained about the wider world, information about distant lands and peoples that would guide future conquests. As the Western campaign drew to its conclusion, Genghis Khan found himself master of territories that stretched from Korea to the Caspian Sea. The empire now encompassed dozens of different peoples, languages, and cultures, all united under the authority of a man who had begun life as an abandoned orphan on the Mongolian steppes. The transformation was so complete that it challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of political power and the possibilities of human achievement. Yet even as he celebrated these unprecedented conquests, the great Khan understood that his greatest challenge was not military, but administrative. How could such vast territories be governed effectively? How could diverse peoples be welded into a unified empire? How could the military virtues that had made conquest possible be preserved while developing the civilian institutions necessary for lasting rule? His solutions to these challenges would prove as revolutionary as his military innovations. The Yasa, the great law code that governed the empire, established uniform standards of justice while respecting local customs. The decimal military system was extended to civilian administration, creating clear chains of command and responsibility. Religious tolerance was proclaimed throughout the empire, allowing conquered peoples to maintain their spiritual traditions while acknowledging Mongol political supremacy. Perhaps most importantly, Genghis Khan created a meritocratic system that offered opportunities for advancement to anyone who served the empire faithfully, regardless of their ethnic background or social origins. Chinese scholars, Persian administrators, Christian missionaries, and Muslim merchants all found places within the imperial hierarchy, their diverse skills contributing to an unprecedented synthesis of human knowledge and capability. The postal system that connected the empire's far-flung territories became a wonder of the medieval world, allowing messages to travel from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of weeks rather than months. This network of roads, way stations, and relay horses not only facilitated imperial administration, but also enabled trade and cultural exchange on a scale never before achieved in human history. As Genghis Khan entered the final phase of his remarkable life, he could survey an empire that surpassed in size and wealth anything that had ever existed. The Mongol domains now encompassed nearly 24 million square miles and ruled over more than 100 million people. From the Pacific shores of China to the steppes of Eastern Europe, a single authority maintained order and facilitated prosperity across distances that had previously been considered impossible to govern. But the great Khan was growing old, and the question of succession weighed heavily on his mind. How could this vast empire survive the death of its founder? How could the unity he had forged through force of personality and military genius be maintained by his heirs? These concerns drove him to spend his final years not in conquest, but in consolidation, establishing institutions and precedents that might allow the empire to outlive its creator. The distribution of territories among his sons was carefully planned to balance their competing interests, while maintaining overall imperial unity. Jochi received the Western territories, Chagatai the Central Asian domains, Ogadai the homeland and the position of Great Khan, and Tolui the Eastern conquests. Each son was given enough power to be satisfied with his inheritance, while being prevented from dominating his brothers. The selection of Ogadai as his successor was perhaps Genghis Khan's most important decision, demonstrating the wisdom that had guided his entire career. Rather than choosing his eldest or most militarily gifted son, he selected the one who possessed the diplomatic skills and administrative ability necessary to hold the empire together. This choice would prove crucial in the decades following his death, as Ogadai's leadership allowed the Mongol Empire to reach its greatest territorial extent. In 1227, while campaigning against the rebellious Western Xia kingdom, Genghis Khan fell ill and died, possibly from injuries sustained in a hunting accident. His death was kept secret for months to prevent uprisings, while his body was transported back to Mongolia for burial. The location of his grave remains unknown to this day, hidden somewhere in the sacred mountains where he had once found refuge as a desperate fugitive. The man who died in that campaign tent had travelled an impossible distance from his origins as Temujin, the abandoned child clutching a blood clot. He had transformed not only his own life, but the entire trajectory of human civilization, creating connections between distant peoples and cultures that would outlast his political empire by centuries. The trade routes he secured, the technologies he spread, and the precedents he established for religious tolerance and administrative efficiency would influence world history Long after the Mongol Empire itself had fragmented and disappeared, the legacy of Genghis Khan defies simple categorization. To his enemies, he was a destroyer who brought devastation to flourishing civilizations. To his followers, he was a liberator who broke down artificial barriers between peoples and created opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than birth. To historians, he remains one of the most consequential figures in human history. A man whose actions reshaped the map of the world and established patterns of interaction between East and West that continue to influence global affairs today. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Genghis Khan's story is not the magnitude of his conquests, but the completeness of his personal transformation. The frightened child who had hidden in the reeds while his enemies searched for him became the supreme commander whose orders were obeyed from sunrise to sunset. The desperate young man who had once begged for mercy from his captors became the emperor whose word was law across 3 continents. This transformation was not achieved through accident or luck, but through the methodical development of qualities that enabled him to master every challenge he encountered. His ability to inspire loyalty, his genius for military strategy, his talent for political organization, and his vision of what was possible when human potential was fully unleashed. All of these capabilities were forged in the crucible of adversity and refined through years of struggle and triumph. Yet beyond all the military victories and political achievements, perhaps the most profound legacy of Genghis Khan lies in the realm of human possibility itself. His story stands as eternal proof that circumstances of birth need not determine the trajectory of life, that even the most desperate beginnings can give rise to extraordinary endings. In a world that often seemed governed by rigid hierarchies and unchangeable social orders, he demonstrated that individual will, properly directed and sustained through adversity, could reshape the very foundations of civilization. The ripple effects of his life continue to pulse through history in ways both obvious and subtle. The genetic legacy of the Mongol expansion can be traced in the DNA of millions of people across Asia and Europe. The cultural exchanges facilitated by Mongol rule introduced gunpowder to the West, brought Islamic mathematical concepts to China, and created the first truly global network of communication and trade. The religious tolerance he championed became a model for later empires, while his meritocratic ideals would eventually influence political systems far removed from the steppes of Mongolia. But perhaps most importantly, the story of Genghis Khan reminds us that the human capacity for transformation is limitless. The same species that produced the abandoned orphan also created the world conqueror. The same mind that once focused solely on finding enough food to survive the next day eventually conceived strategies that spanned continents and centuries. This duality speaks to something fundamental about human nature, our ability to transcend our circumstances through vision, determination, and the willingness to embrace change. As you drift deeper into sleep, carried along by the rhythm of hoofbeats across ancient grasslands, let your mind absorb the deeper truths embedded in this extraordinary tale. Every person carries within themselves both the frightened child and the potential emperor, both the capacity for despair and the spark of greatness. The difference between those who remain trapped by their circumstances and those who transcend them often lies not in their initial advantages, but in their willingness to continue fighting when all seems lost. The winds that once carried the smoke of burning cities and the thunder of Mongol cavalry now whisper through the ruins of empires, reminding us that all worldly power is temporary, but the human spirit endures. Genghis Khan's empire crumbled as all empires must. but the example of his transformation from powerless to powerful, from rejected to revered, from orphan to emperor, continues to inspire those who dare to dream beyond their present limitations. In the end, this is not merely the story of one remarkable man, but a testament to the boundless potential that lies dormant within us all. As sleep claims you tonight, rest in the knowledge that the same force that lifted a homeless child to become master of the world flows through your own veins, waiting only for the right circumstances and sufficient courage to reveal itself. The blood clot that marked Genghis Khan's birth was not a unique gift, but a symbol of the warrior spirit that exists in every human heart, ready to emerge when life demands nothing less than complete transformation. Sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with the understanding that your own impossible journey has only just begun.